Hello everyone, good to see you all, hope you're well, and apologies this is taking so long, but I've been trying to work out various technical issues and so on, which I won't bore you with, but I finally found a way I can do this at least, and I'm going to talk, as you can see, about the Ukraine-Russia crisis today, and some of the historical background to this whole thing, to go way back. I think what happens a lot, of course, with the news and the media and so on, we tend to get it's kind of immediacy, and we don't really get the historical background and the context for everything. So I'm going to try and kind of maybe explain where this whole thing comes from, so you can maybe see this conflict in a broader historical kind of light. Now, what you've got is, as you can see on the screen there, we have the end of communism, of course, and we think of the fall of the Berlin Wall and all these all this excitement, and it is a kind of remarkable time. If you're old enough, like me, to have lived through it, it was a remarkable kind of time, and there was lots of euphoria. Now, the problem was, despite all that, and a new age of freedom and democracy and so on, many people started to warn that perhaps the region itself of Eastern Europe could be headed towards a new era, not of democracy and so on, but maybe ethnic conflict. That was the worry. Because these nationalist passions amongst all these countries, and I'll show you here actually what we've got, we're talking about these countries, had been kind of subsumed under communism for a long time. And Eastern Europe itself, remember, is a region which had never really had a chance, as it were, to work out its borders in the same way Western Europe had. So the borders had always been kind of dictated to Eastern Europeans. So you get a domination of empires for so long. You have the Austrians and you have the Ottomans, you have the Germans and the Russians and so on, and constant partitions. And then you have, of course, the Versailles Treaty in the First World War, where some of these states are on the Allied side, some are on the Axis side. So they're some are punished, some are rewarded. And then, so the borders themselves, again, are kind of artificial and filled with lots and lots of different minorities. There's lots of minorities and rather bitter revisionist sort of states here that want their territory back and their people back. Then, of course, you get to the Second World War and you have a similar kind of issue, because now it becomes part of the kind of Nazi empire. And later on, of course, as the war goes on, the Soviet Empire. And once again, Hitler himself tends to play off a lot of these states against one another. So if you look at something like Czechoslovakia, of course, it's gobbled up by the Poles have a little bit, they're given a little bit, and the Hungarians take a chunk of it, and Slovakia becomes itself an independent state. So everyone's looking to get a bit more territory back, what they believe is their homeland. So the problem is these problems are going to put into a stasis now under communism. And you don't have this kind of border revisionism. But now, as it were, the lids come off. The fear is that we're going to have a whole load of Eastern European ethnic wars. And that could be absolutely devastating. What is kind of remarkable, though, is that doesn't happen. There are tensions, there are conflicts, there are bits of violence here and there. But you don't get this kind of whole collapse into ethnic warfare. That doesn't really happen. Now, the reasons for that are really, they're economic, they're also cultural and political to some extent, but it's the pull really of Europe, of Western Europe particularly. The idea and the phrase that's always used is to return to Europe. And I say money and security are the main reasons that people keep their nationalist passions, as it were, down. And I'll give you an example. We talk about money as the huge economic issues are huge. The disparity between East and West is enormous. In 1989, so when everything collapses, Eastern European GDP is only 49% of that of Western Europe. 49%. And certainly, after centuries of sort of this domination by these larger powers and whatever, they're looking to find some kind of framework which is going to protect their independence. And particularly the EU is one way. That's one framework to protect them, but also NATO as well. And you'll see here's the membership and how they join and who's in it and whatever. Getting into NATO is very slow. It's very bureaucratic. It's very frustrating. I mean, we see this kind of today. You know, people are applying to join NATO, and it's a whole, and the EU as well. It's a long, drawn-out kind of process. But what it does provide for Eastern European countries is a clear kind of pathway, a way forward, and an incentive as well. So let's avoid, you know, the border revisionism, ethnic conflict or whatever. Let's not worry about that because there's a bigger prize. And also, to some extent, kind of backsliding into authoritarianism. And I think that's generally the kind of will of most people in the immediate kind of aftermath of the fall of the Soviet Union. We also have, of course, a shocking example of what could happen. And that comes, of course, in Yugoslavia. And it's a warning of what, if nationalism spirals out of control, in these countries, you know, I say they've all got minorities. They all want to essentially revise their states because they don't believe their state contains all of their people. And but that's kind of what happens in Yugoslavia, the former Yugoslavia, and look what we get: ethnic cleansing, massacre, and it becomes a pariah now. Someone like Serbia, and its future now. It's outside of the NATO. It's having bombing, of course, Belgrade. You know, that's not what they don't want that. So the passions are kind of subsumed for a while under this general sense of wishing to, I say, you know, move forward towards prosperity and security. The trouble is, though, and I think this is what we're living through now, this sort of consensus, this post-communist consensus, is not going to last forever. So you have the deeper sort of historical patterns emerging once again. So they've been kept quiet for a while. But what we see in Eastern Europe, and I say we're going to talk about Ukraine a lot today, you can see this, you know, borders getting altered by violence now. Claims, these rabid claims of kind of ethno-nationalism, which, again, are becoming an increasing problem. The rise of kind of authoritarian governments and so on. And that's really the way to situate what's happening in Ukraine. There is the argument, which is very depressing, to say that Eastern Europe needs some kind of reckoning. Horrible thought, sort of bloodletting in a way. You know, nations are created through these constant wars and conflicts until finally you get to a point, rather like Western Europe has, where you settle your borders. You know who is who and where is where. But sadly, a lot of blood has to be spilt in order to get to that point. And the thought is now that Eastern Europe has never had that reckoning. And maybe that's a horrible thought for the future, but if you think about it, it's potentially where things are kind of going. Some places, of course, don't change. And I just want to mention one place that doesn't change. It doesn't talk about this idea of going back to Europe and so on, and embracing democracy and all these kind of Western kind of ideas. And one of these is Belarus, of course. And just to mention Belarus as a contrasting example, of course, Belarus is horribly damaged by the Chernobyl disaster. I can't remember what the figure is. It's something like 13 to 15% of Belarusian territory is basically unusable. You know, still today. And it enters really a kind of weird kind of time warp. Maybe there'll be more coming in the future, but the only remaining dictatorship is what you get in Belarus, which is under this man here, Alexander Lukashenko. He's elected democratically in 1994, but immediately turns out to be some kind of authoritarian and very Stalinist in his kind of view. He even praises Hitler. This guy. And when you think about what Hitler did in Belarus during the Second World War, it's astonishing to think that anyone in Belarus would have anything positive to say about Hitler. And here he is with Putin. You do get a sense of him as the kind of man he is there. Maybe this is the closest thing he can get to Hitler today, you know, in the shape of Putin. But once he gets into power, I say he becomes more authoritarian and he looks to kind of preserve the old Stalinist ways. You see this with the flags. He tries to bring back the Soviet flag, you see this. So he tries to sneak it in there. But it doesn't last. It actually is changed eventually. They have a referendum. I'll show you actually the flag of Belarus today. This is the flag here. But yeah, but he's promising to bring Belarus closer to Russia politically, economically. But he's an odd character. I mean, very strange. I'll give you an example of what Lukashenko does. At one point, he bans pictures in the media and so on of foreign female models, because he says Belarusian women are the most beautiful women in the world, and therefore we don't want any pictures of these foreigners. Strange character. But he does what all authoritarians do. He shuts down the independent media, he persecutes dissidents and so on. So Belarus remains kind of stuck, where everywhere else that we are getting this change. Now, in 2005 in Belarus, we have a revolution, a civil revolution, which is promoting democracy. They want to join, I say, the rest of Eastern Europe. What's wonderful about this is they use jeans. They use denim as a kind of symbol of their uprising, which is wonderful. So we've had like the Velvet Revolution, and you have the Orange Revolution, all these different coloured revolutions in the post-communist period. The Baltic Revolution, they have the singing revolution, of course, in the Baltics, which sounds wonderful. How good is that as a revolution? But their symbol is going to be denim, it's going to be jeans, which really gives you an idea just how much jeans come to symbolise Western values and democracy and so on. We take our jeans for granted and we just throw them on. But in Eastern Europe, jeans represent something very, very deep-seated, a kind of aspiration to freedom and so on. But again, this uprising is suppressed. In 2011, so they don't go away, the opposition, they try a new tactic, which is a very strange tactic. What they basically do is they agree on kind of social media to meet together in the streets of Belarusian cities. And what they do is they walk along silently and then stop. They kind of block the pavements and the roads and so on, obstruct traffic and whatever. And they just stand there completely silently. So there's no violence, there's nothing like that. And then after a short period, they start clapping. They just start applauding. This is their kind of idea. So I'd say it's a kind of non-spoken, I suppose it symbolises the way our voices are quietened by this authoritarian figure or whatever. The trouble is, though, I mean, it's all very clever and so on, but, you know, authoritarians don't care about that. I mean, he sends in the police and arrests people. And they're all pushed out now, and I think you get something like 2 weeks in jail if you're one of these people, what are called the clappers. So that's what they call in Belarus, these protesters. So that's gotten rid of as well. So that's just one mention in Belarus, which is still itself in a, Lukashenko himself, of course, still around, but getting older and older and older. And what's going to happen when Lukashenko goes is another thing worth watching in the future. A big concern, particularly in Eastern Europe, is how it relates to Russia after the fall of the Soviet Union. The thing is, Russia itself, of course, initially, and again, you may remember these days, Russia seems to embrace liberal democracy at the start, but then it begins to shut things down again. That's a big matter of broader European concern, of course. And one major reason is the dependence on Russia in Europe, all of Europe, for energy resources. That's huge. I mean, in 2014, Europe imported 1/3 of all its gas from Russia. 1/3. Now, that, of course, they're trying to change that very, very quickly now after what's happened, of course, in Ukraine. It's particularly worse, though, for Eastern European countries. They take even more energy from Russia. So Russia, as it were, holds energy is crucial in modern societies, and they have the whip hand in many ways over many countries. And while Western Europe might be able to diversify and develop away from that, in Eastern Europe, that's going to be an ongoing kind of problem. Now, a hint of the way this process, and again, what we'll see in Ukraine, there are straws in the wind. There are examples now in the post-communist period of these kind of border conflicts, these kind of border revisionist conflicts. And you see this particularly in Moldova. Now, you remember Putin's been talking a lot about Moldova. There's been sort of worries about Moldova. And that comes here. There is Moldova there. And this is the self-proclaimed Transnistria. So essentially what's happened is you've got lots of ethnic Russian minorities in these newly declared independent states, which were once part of the Soviet Union. And people have moved in for various kind of reasons and whatever, but they are sizable. And particularly along these kind of border regions. And what you tend to get is these people now are usually whipped up with a sense of, this is not your state, you don't belong here, you're Russian, and they start agitating politically. And then, of course, they end up winning support then from Moscow in order to do that. And we'll see that's exactly what has happened in eastern Ukraine as well. But this is another one. This is a kind of strange, frozen kind of conflict that will eventually be worked out, in our own lifetime. We'll see this whole thing kind of play out. But this is there, you can see right from the start. So right from 1990, you have this. So 2 decades of that. Now, of course, from 1999, leadership in Russia passes to a former KGB Lieutenant Colonel, Vladimir Putin. And here he is here. This is when Boris Yeltsin dies. And what he's doing to Russia is very debatable. Of course, he is an authoritarian, but what do you call Russia now? What kind of government is it? My favourite phrase that people use is managed democracy. We have a lot of managed democracies now with the rise of populism and so on. There are a lot of managed democracies out there. It's a very sinister phrase. And Putin himself is someone he's an absolute throwback. Putin is someone now who absolutely regrets the collapse of the Soviet Union. So when it collapses in 1991, he says himself it was the worst geopolitical tragedy of the 20th century, the collapse of the Soviet Union. It's kind of, remarkable. So is he trying to recreate the Soviet Union? I suppose to some extent he is. But you look at Putin's views, and you look at the kind of person you're dealing with. I'll give you one great example of this. If you look at Putin's views on the Nazi-Soviet pact back in 1939, so just before the war begins, of course we get this pact between the Nazis and the Soviets, and of course then Hitler will kind of betray Stalin and all of that and all the hell that follows from that. But if you look at what Putin says, he does in 2009, he says it was a terrible thing, it was a terrible betrayal, the party condemns the whole thing. But that changes then over time. By 2014, he suggests, well, it wasn't actually that bad because he's an authoritarian, and he likes other authoritarians. And then he moves the argument on wonderfully and says, if you actually look at it, but this was all Britain's fault. It's kind of funny. It gets the British, they're the ones who are basically responsible. If you get right down to it, the British are to blame. But, as we see with lots of these kind of authoritarian figures, which are growing up around the world now, some of them very prominent, it's, even though it can be frustrating to look at the versions of history that they espouse, which are usually nonsense, in some late night tweet or whatever it might be, they're important, I suppose, because they give a hint to what could be future policy. And so you have to listen to it, even though you find it, that you find it incredibly sort of absurd, their kind of take on the world. Now, what you do get, I say, you get all these millions of ethnic Russians becoming these minorities then in these states. And I say, this is the problem we have in somewhere like Ukraine. And how do you cope? And I'll talk about this in a second, but how do you cope as a newly independent former Soviet republic with the presence of lots of ethnic Russians? And if you look at something like the Baltic states, like Latvia, Estonia, there were so many Russians in Latvia and Estonia, then the Estonians and Latvians almost became minorities themselves in their own country. And since they've got independence, they've introduced all these restrictive sort of citizenship laws and so on. There's lots of them. In Lithuania, and Lithuania's, I suppose, kind of cool in a way. I kind of like this. What they decided to do as soon as they got independence was just grant everybody citizenship. So they didn't bother with trying to restrict various groups and minorities. Year zero, where everyone's going to be a Lithuanian. That's kind of nice. If only the world was kind of like that today. But what you have got, and this is very, very important to understand, countries now with very little experience of independence. are emerging. These countries have no history of independence at all. They've always been under some kind of big brother figure. I say, whether that's going back to the Austrians or the Germans or the Ottomans or whatever it might be, or Hitler or Stalin. They've always been, I say, subservient in that sense. But now they have this freedom, and they don't have a great deal of experience how to manage this whole thing. Now, with Putin, of course, we do get lots of tenser relations with, and he's used certainly these ethnic Russian minorities as a way of agitating for his wider geopolitical kind of aims. And this, and I'll put this up earlier, but just to explain what this is. In 2007, Estonian officials decided to move the statue, a big bronze statue of a Soviet soldier, out of central Tallinn now, and move it to a military cemetery nearby. So they're going to move it. Obviously, it's a new era. We want to get rid of the old Soviet, statues and iconography and all that sort of stuff. That caused now ethnic Russians to start protesting, because this sort of repositioning now of the state as more independent and moving away, changing its history and changing its public space now to reflect that independence, that immediately caused a big kind of reaction. So the Russian government as well got involved in this. And I say the links between these Russian minorities and the Russian government is very, very strong. It does actually lead, by the way, this to one of the first examples of this cyber war, which is something that many people in Europe are very used to now, which is Russian computer hackers. Now, they turned their energies on Estonia. So shut down government websites and all this kind of stuff, impede all the work of the Estonian government. And of course, so from there, that has become now itself a new tactic. And, if you do live in Western Europe, you'll be used to that. You'll be used to, flights delayed or deliveries delayed, or the shutdown of say, government portals, and that's becoming something now that everyone's kind of used to. But it begins really with Estonia. So these little minorities, so like Transnistria, you've got this kind of thing going on. Another example of this comes in Georgia, of course, and this is August 2008, where there were clashes of these breakaway enclaves. Now, of course, so that the Russian minority in South Ossetia, these are being backed by Russia now, who agitating, giving them money and supplies and so on, benighting various kind of rather extreme kind of nationalist Russians. And these begin to agitate. And of course, there was terrible violence in Georgia. But again, we have a kind of stalemate there now, rather like you have in Moldova. And that's another conflict that's not resolved. So we've still got to wait for that one that's another one that's on the books in the future. Again, these may seem kind of remote things, but they do indicate the sort of presentness of the past. And the fact that, I say, these tensions are coming back, that have always existed between, I say, within Eastern Europe, between its minorities and its majority population. In 2010, I just want to mention this because it's something I've mentioned before in other kind of contexts. There was a terrible tragedy which kind of underlined the sort of resonance, I suppose, of history and all of this. And this is when we get a delegation, I'll explain what this is, a delegation of top Polish government officials flies to the city of Smolensk in Russia to commemorate the Kyivan massacre, which is a terrible massacre, of course, carried out near Smolensk by Stalin in 1940. So 70 years earlier, there's going to be a commemoration. All these Polish dignitaries and so on flew over there. But what happens is, on the flight, it crashes now. The plane is coming into land. We don't think there's any foul play involved in this. It was very foggy. The weather was terrible, whatever. But all 96 passengers and crew on board were killed. And you can see just on the list there of how prominent Poland's president, all these officials and so on, these were all killed on the way to commemorate another tragedy. So a tragedy on top of a tragedy happened. Also, among the dignitaries, and this is just something, again, that is worth mentioning. And that's this lady here. This is Anna. Now, if you know anything about what happens with Solidarity in Poland, of course, the whole Solidarity movement begins in the Gdansk shipyard. And it's when this lady is actually sacked. And then people start saying, well, where's Anna? We like Anna. What's going on? And they start protesting and so on. And that grows and grows and grows then and becomes eventually kind of, grow into Solidarity. And she becomes this great iconic figure. But she herself dies on that plane, which is kind of sad. So she's one of the great founding women of Solidarity and this whole process of independence within Eastern Europe. So even in a kind of more sort of dynamic and mobile Eastern Europe, you can see the way that there is kind of potential always for tragedy and there's potential for triumph as well in these things. And it's a very volatile kind of situation. And of course, that brings us now, finally, to the whole history of Ukraine. And let me just show you here. So here's Europe, obviously. But just to give you an idea about Ukraine. It has very, very deep roots, the crisis in Ukraine. Again, alongside the things I've already kind of mentioned. What you've got going on, and this is, I think, a general problem, I say, for Eastern Europe. See, there's like a kind of slow-motion identity crisis in Eastern Europe. And again, in this case, particularly with both Ukraine and Russia, it goes back centuries, this. So if we want to understand, I say, the present, we need to go back and look at the relationship between these two nations. What it's often said, and to understand the centrality of Ukraine to Russian identity, and I do love this phrase, with Ukraine, Russia is an empire. Without Ukraine, Russia is a country. So Ukraine is absolutely central to the imperial ambitions of Russia. And as I say, everyone repeats it. Generations of scholars have talked about this kind of idea. But it gives you an idea, I said, the emotional weight, as it were, that Ukraine has held in the kind of Russian imagination. Ukrainian identity itself has always been very complex. On the one hand, they do have a very long shared past and history with Russia, but they also have historic affinities as well to the West. And that comes, as we'll see, through Poland, Lithuania, through Austria, and through the whole kind of Catholic world of the Austrians and the West. And so Ukraine is a place that's full of diversity, particularly in terms of its historical memories and in terms of its orientations. And in many ways, Ukraine is an illustration, I say, of this larger problem, this Eastern European kind of patterns that we might see. It's kind of microcosm of all of that. Overlapping empires, shifting borders, ethnic minorities, competing cultural influences. All these things are kind of there. Now, the thing about Ukraine, I've mentioned, let's say, some examples of these tensions that exist in Moldova and Georgia and so on. One thing, of course, about Ukraine, which makes it maybe different, is its sheer size. I mean, after Russia, Ukraine is the second largest country in Europe. It's huge. It's the largest country located entirely within Europe as well. And I'll give you an idea, compare it, if I can show you here, actually, where is it? Here it is, compared to the UK. So you get an idea, if you know the UK, it gives you an idea of the size of this. It's about the size of Texas, something like that. So it's a good size. About 45 million people live there. And of course, it's well known now for its fertile black soil. It's famously the breadbasket of Europe and so on. And as I just showed you a second ago, the flag of independent Ukraine, and I do think this is wonderful, is a literal rendering of the landscape. Isn't that wonderful? So you've got this big blue sky and then these vast sort of very productive fields. You get a sense of what Ukraine kind of looks like now, this flat land that it is. Isn't that a wonderful flag to have? What it does hint at is the kind of open geography that has shaped Ukrainian history. So you have this North European plain, and certainly Ukraine itself is one of these places where invaders have moved through, or people have gone back and forward and back and forth. It's very easy because it's very flat land. It's very easy to move through. It doesn't have many natural barriers, would be the point. And of course, Ukraine itself, the translation of Ukraine, essentially kind of borderland is what it means. It means kind of frontier land or borderland. It gives you a kind of idea. It's a land that's repeatedly been contested by larger powers. Now, if we go way back, to give you an idea of the history of Ukraine, and I'm on a way back, and I'll show you here, back to the age of the Kyivan Rus, the golden age of Rus, out of which Russia will be actually created, which is centered on Kyiv itself, ironically. This region will be transformed by the arrival of Mongol invaders. So what you got at Kyivan Rus is essentially a lot of Vikings basically come down, and they begin to establish something that kind of looks like a state. I mean, it's quite rudimentary, really, but it's something that's now begins to form itself into some sort of homogeneous entity. And that's the first one that we have, really. The rest is pretty empty and scattered. But we do then get, of course, to upset everything, the invasion of the Mongols. And I'll show you here. So the Mongols are going to blast in now from the east and do what Mongols do. And, of course, they will go right through Ukraine. I say Ukraine is not difficult to go through. And burning and pillaging and destroying as they go. And, of course, you know, you think about the vastness of the Mongol Empire. If I can show you this actual map here, this might give you an idea. Pardon me. But you can see kind of how irrelevant kind of Eastern Europe is in the size of this thing. It's absolutely enormous. Now, the thing about the Mongols, of course, famously, is they don't leave any kind of permanent settlements or permanent evidence that they were really there. So, unlike the Romans, say, you don't kind of leave behind ruins and cities and roads and, pardon me, you don't have any of that kind of infrastructure. So, they come in like, you know, the tide. Lots of things are destroyed, and then when they leave, when they eventually go, there's nothing. They don't, I say, leave anything. So that's a big difference, of course, between Eastern and Western Europe. I mean, one thing you've got in Western Europe, you have the legacy of the Romans, and of course, Roman roads and so on, and cities and harbours and things are all used right into the medieval period and beyond. You don't have any of that kind of infrastructure. One of the reasons you have such poverty and such kind of economic backwardness in Eastern Europe is because you don't have the Roman legacy, as it were. They do, by the way, leave, and just to mention, I say they end up leaving eventually and go, but they do leave behind their descendants, and this is in the shape of these, the Crimean Tatars. There they are. So in Crimea, this is where they're based, the Tatars. So the Tatars in the Crimea are actually the descendants of the original Mongols. Some of them decide to stay, and they stay in the Crimea. But what you've got is, so they go back out and leave a huge power vacuum now. And of course, as they do that, new powers now kind of move in. And one of the biggest and most important, of course, is this, Poland, Lithuania. Now, this is almost a forgotten state now, Poland, Lithuania. It was absolutely enormous back in the day, but it's basically disappeared now. And they establish control over much of what is now Ukraine. And they do leave a very deep imprint on Ukrainian society. One particularly, of course, is the church, the creation of the Ukrainian Unit Church, which is it's an odd thing in many ways. It's an Orthodox church, but it recognizes the Roman Catholic, the authority of the Roman Catholic Church as well. So it's you see the Polish influence and also the Eastern influence as well. Now, I say, as it expands, the reality is what it's expanding into. This territory is pretty wild. This is a frontier land, what we tend to call Ukraine now, certainly Eastern Ukraine. And it comes to be called the Wild Fields. Now, the way to think about this, the Wild Fields, as a frontier zone, think about this like the Wild West in America. So think about America expanding. Now, technically, legally, constitutionally, it kind of owns all this vast territory, say the Louisiana Purchase, but no one really controls it. There's no real government in it. There's lots of people there, but they're sort of scattered around, and you know, it's fairly lawless. That's really what's going on in Ukraine in this period. So you get in what will be Western Ukraine, you do get the establishment of the Polish influence is more solid. But as you move further to the east, it becomes, as I say, wild and frays kind of at the edges. Now, these lands, these wild fields, are very important in Ukrainian history because they become, I suppose, rather like the Wild West in many ways, a place where people can go who are fleeing oppression, fleeing feudalism, fleeing serfdom, political domination, whatever it might be. And they flee off there where they can live essentially outside of the law. Now, these men and women come to be known as Cossacks. And this is where the Cossacks come from. Cossack comes from a Turkish word which means adventurer, a free person kind of. You get a sense of a sort of frontier kind of territory. And yeah, they're sort of tribal horsemen, kind of moving around, have lots of fighting with each other. They organise themselves, very independent, fiercely independent kind of codes of conduct between themselves, and they establish these kind of semi-nomadic kind of communities on the steppes north of the Black Sea in this hazy kind of wild area. And what they tend to do, the Cossacks, is they shift their loyalties as circumstance demands. So sometimes they'll fight for the Polish Lithuanians, or sometimes they'll fight against them. Whatever. They'll make the decision to remain essentially kind of ruggedly and fiercely independent themselves. And particularly their martial skill is very valuable, of course, to both sides, because it's a rough, scary place where the Cossacks are living, and they are used to constant kind of violence between themselves or whatever. And this idea is very, very central to Ukrainian cultural memory. So if you ever go to Ukraine, I mean, God, if any of us ever go to Ukraine again after everything that's happened, but it'd be a nice thought. You'll see this Cossack imagery, the Cossack idea is very, very central. In the same way, I suppose, you might think of Scotland, or you might think of Highland clans or whatever, that kind of thing. There's always an image. Again, the frontiers person in America is another kind of icon of a figure. But the Cossack is something that's central to this kind of identity. The Cossacks, I say, they're rather mythologized, but you can hear them if you listen to the Ukrainian national anthem, which I won't sing it, don't worry. But you can. The Cossacks are actually in that. Now, the story of the Cossacks is in 1648, the Cossack leader, this is Bohdan Khmelnytsky, he launches an uprising now against Polish rule. So the Poles are kind of infringing more and more, as it were, on these wild lands as they're kind of expanding and so on. So he revolts against them. And I say this draws in, not just the Poles, but it also draws in now the rising power of Russia. Now, Russia, as I say, had suffered terribly from the Mongols and had taken a lot longer, as it were, to get its act together. And now, in this period, it's beginning to finally assert itself. And this is one of the reasons Poland and Lithuania has been allowed to grow, as it were, because Russia itself has been kind of weak. But now you've got another power emerging. And after years and years of war, the two states themselves agree to divide these wild lands, these contested lands, essentially between them. So what it means is more and more of Ukraine now comes under Russian rule, and of course Russian cultural influence and all of that stuff. And the once independent Cossacks now they're made various promises by the Russians, particularly, that they'll be allowed to keep, as it were, this kind of semi-independent identity, but they become essentially enforcers for the Russian Tsar. The Russian Tsar becomes, as it were, their new tribal leader, if you like. So they tried for decades to kind of balance this whole thing between the pressures of the Poles, Lithuanians on one side, the Russians to the east, but eventually that becomes impossible. And they're forced, as it were, to choose a side. Now, the treaty itself, when they signed this treaty, you can still hear people talking about this treaty now today. You'll hear this on the news, people talking about this treaty. It's amazing how people bring up these hundreds and hundreds of years old treaties and talk about how valid the whole thing was. The belief is, when this treaty is signed, that they're receiving essentially the Tsar's protection. They'll offer him service and so on. But there is a guarantee of this kind of autonomy. I see this sort of semi-autonomous existence. But of course, what they realise, the Cossacks, very quickly is they've just basically exchanged one set of overlords for another. So they get rid of the Poles, but they end up getting now Russian overlords, and it's all very, very similar. But I say we get this partition eventually between both sides, which essentially divides the Ukrainian lands along the Dnieper River. And it formalises this division, which, again, we'll see, and we see today, of course, which shapes very much this region and between a Russian and, as it were, a Western kind of influence. Now, of course, partitions itself, we have a lot of partitions going on in Eastern Europe. And, of course, what's going to happen is, and if I show you here, irony of ironies, that the Poles, after themselves partitioning Ukraine, themselves, of course, will suffer here in these partitions. So, let's say Poland, Lithuania, which is an incredibly powerful state for a good while now, is going to be gobbled up cynically, of course, by the Austrians, the Prussians, and the Russians. And it's going to essentially disappear. And now it means the final end of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth in 1795 means most Ukrainians in this share-out now, this cynical imperial share-out, find themselves inside the Russian Empire, as you can see. But there is one very important exception to that, and this is incredibly important, and that is the province of Galicia. And here is where Galicia is, because what happens in the share-out, this goes under the Austrian Habsburgs. So they take control of this bit of Ukraine. And this creates a new and very lasting contrast in Ukrainian history. So that a Western Ukrainian region, shaped by Austrian law, Catholic influence, and what is kind of relative cultural tolerance, and an Eastern Ukrainian region which is shaped by Russian autocracy and imperial policy. In the territories absorbed by the Russian Empire, policymakers assume essentially that these populations, this Ukrainian population, will eventually disappear. They'll eventually sort of melt into Russian culture more generally, and they derisively call Ukrainians little Russians. So eventually that's all going to kind of disappear. And of course, under Catherine the Great, she's going to expand this even further now, taking more territory near the Black Sea. And she will call this area New Russia. So Ukraine becomes now New Russia. And it gives you an idea. I said the future vision of what Ukraine will be in the future is essentially just, a new part of Russia, essentially. And any Ukrainian identity or independence or whatever is basically completely snuffed out. And to achieve this, under Catherine, and something followed by many, many Russian leaders going forward, they introduce harsh cultural restrictions. And this is a wonderful reenactment you get of the of what Catherine does. So the Ukrainian language, for example, is banned. It's banned from schools. It's banned. You can't publish and write in it. Ukrainian books, language books, they were got rid of as well. Nationalist intellectuals, if you like, these what we call dissidents, I suppose, today, they're censored and monitored and persecuted and whatever, arrested. So the goal, I say, is clear, to erase completely the idea of any kind of distinct Ukrainian nation with its own history and just fold its people now into a broader Russian kind of whole. That's the idea. Now, the reason that's important, of course, and why I mentioned Galicia, is in the West, in the Austrian Empire, the situation is very different. Because in the Austrian Empire, what you've got, of course, famously, is this vast multi-ethnic realm of the Habsburgs. And you can see all the different minorities here. And, of course, this is the reason it will end up falling apart in the end. And the only way they keep this thing going for so long is by playing a very complicated balancing game between all the ethnic groups, who are all played off against one another and so on. And they're all incredibly Bolshevik as well, which is wonderful. I mean, you know, you go to the parliament in Vienna, which is made up of all these different ethnic groups now, all under the Austrian monarchy. But they're all there arguing for their rights, whoever they might be, the Croats and the Czechs and so on, all speaking their own language. And because they will not compromise, we will not use, you know, German or whatever someone else's language. It's chaos. Of course, Hitler goes to see that parliament famously when he's young, when he's in Vienna. And this, you know, he talks about this in Mein Kampf. And he talks about going to Vienna and seeing this, and this disgusts him, as you can imagine, someone like him. This idea of this kind of heterogeneous, that's not a country at all, you know, this, and he hates this kind of, all this sort of polyglot kind of empire that you've got. So what it means for the Ukrainians, now, so the Ukrainians are in there. Ukrainians are often called Ruthenians, by the way. If you ever see the word Ruthenian, basically means Ukrainian, just another name for them. But it means they're part of this. So those people are living in Galicia, in western Ukraine, as it were, under the Austrians. They're able to cultivate, I suppose, a modern national identity. They're allowed their own literature and their own culture and language and so on. So the flame, as it were, of Ukrainian identity remains and grows within this small part of the Austrian Empire. Very, very important. Where everyone else is being subsumed and kind of turned Russified and so on. Now, we're not saying the Austrian rule is idyllic. Absolutely not. It's not perfect. But compared to what's going on in Russia, it absolutely is very, very different. So you've got Ukrainian schools and newspapers and cultural associations and all this kind of thing. And this Western Ukrainian cultural revival is going to be absolutely central, I say, in the creation of modern Ukrainian nationalism. Now, during the First World War, of course, when everything is going to change again, and just to show you here, here's where the front lines are going to be. I mean, this is the thing about, I say, Ukraine. As I say, it's very flat, and a lot of armies move through it quite quickly. You think of Hitler moving through it, don't you, when he invades in 1941 the Soviet Union, these tanks, kind of panzer divisions rolling across Ukraine. It's sadly kind of easy, as it were, to move across. And of course, the front lines themselves will often be in Ukrainian territory. And that's what happens in the First World War, and it becomes a terrible kind of battleground. And what tends to happen is the Germans advance, the Russians tend to carry out a kind of scorched earth policy. So as they retreat, and they do retreat massively, of course, as you can see with the lines here, in the First World War, they tend to destroy things. So I'll give you an example here. So everything they blow up bridges and they burn villages and all kinds of things. The Russians do this. But then, of course, the Germans come in as well, and they do the same kind of thing. So the Ukrainians are right in the middle of this terrible kind of battle. And you get now, again, here's 1914, here's refugees. So these are all fleeing now to the east as the Germans advance and the Russians retreat. So millions of people fleeing now to these. It's chaos. So that's what the First World War. Again, we often think of it as kind of maybe a Western European view, is rather static and so on in the Western Front and so on. Of course, in Eastern Europe, it's very different. There's a lot of movement and so on, a lot of displacement, a lot of suffering and displacement of peoples and so on. So the trouble is for the Ukrainians, and this is another big problem they have. It's so sad that right from the First World War, and even, I see, earlier than this, there is always a suspicion, because Ukraine lies on this kind of borderline, this fracture point between East and West, that both sides tend to think that the Ukrainians harbour sympathies for the other side. That's always the case. So they're always under suspicion. We see this during the Second World War. You see it, of course, after communism. You see it during communism, of course, as well. And what will happen is several short-lived Ukrainian states will emerge just at the end of the First World War, and they've got to 1921. There's various states, of course, especially when the Russian Revolution happens and there's chaos everywhere. You have the Ukrainian People's Republic, you have a German kind of puppet state as well, which is established. But all this is going to be swept away, of course, eventually, by the chaos of the revolution, of civil war, the rise of the Bolsheviks and so on. And yeah, this short expression of Ukrainian independence now is going to basically disappear. So between the world wars, Ukraine again finds itself kind of divided by borders. And I say the borders themselves now change, as you can see. So this is what we look at before and after the First World War. Most Ukrainians live in the Soviet Union. Others, though, live in Poland, Romania, Czechoslovakia, in that little, what was Galicia essentially now, which is part of 3 different countries now. And it means that Ukrainian communities experienced very different political systems, very different cultural policies, economic conditions. And so that, that Ukrainian, Western Ukrainian kind of more Western European style of culture and economy and so on and politics, that will linger on in the interwar period because it's divided between these again democratic, what will become eventually authoritarian states, but for a while at least democratic. And that's going to echo right through, as I say, into the modern era. Inside the Soviet Union, of course, where most Ukrainians now are living, Stalin cracks down on Ukrainian cultural leaders. So they never really trust the Ukrainians, as I say, because they're on a borderland and they're not to be trusted. So writers and teachers and intellectuals are arrested, exiled, executed. And of course, it all comes to a head in the horror that is the Holodomor, the terror famine of the early 1930s. And there's a very sad quote there from, we're talking the Holodomor, millions and millions of people die. This is an attempt, of course, Stalin's forced collectivization campaign. Grain is requisitioned because, huge amounts of agriculture, as you can imagine, in Ukraine with all this soil. And yeah, a lot of the food now is taken from Ukrainian villages. And the result is this mass starvation. And yeah, it's very, very tragic. Here's some figures actually here to give you an idea of what we're talking about, the scale of this. Millions and millions dead. And of course, for Ukrainians, the Holodomor remains the defining trauma of the 20th century, because it's a deliberate assault on Ukrainian society, is how they see it. And of course, it's a warning as well of what any expression of national independence will actually lead to. It's a dreadful, dreadful story. Now, with the coming of the Second World War, some Ukrainian nationalists hoped that the Germans might be able to help them. And again, these are people who tend to be based in the West, as it were, outside of Russian control in this bit of Galicia and so on. And among their leaders was this man here. This is Stepan Bandera. Now, before the war in Poland, Bandera was active in the organization of Ukrainian nationalists. And you can see he's a real proper, he's rather right-wing, this guy. He's a real right ethno-national kind of Ukrainian. And what he did in Poland was he waged a campaign of assassinations against Polish officials, essentially trying to undermine Polish rule in this part of Western Ukraine that was in Poland. So he's fighting basically everybody. So when the Second World War comes along, people like him and many Ukrainian nationalists, they align with Nazi Germany. Because they can see, of course, what Hitler's doing. I say he's creating Slovakia and he's dividing up all these states and so on, that maybe they'll create their own Ukrainian state now, which they can rule over. Of course, some of them do participate in the Nazi campaign against the Jews, and including collaboration with the Einsatzgruppen as well. And of course, we look at something like Baba Yar, there's terrible massacre, there's terrible atrocities carried out in Ukraine, near Kyiv, tens of thousands are murdered. You have a lot of Ukrainians involved in this. But don't think Ukrainians, as it were, are all kind of, pro-Nazi, which is a kind of Putin line. They're really divided. What they're interested in is Ukraine, of getting something out of Ukraine, and they're hoping that the Germans might, if they help the Germans, they might somehow create some kind of independent state. Many, of course, Ukrainians fight on the Russian side. They are divided again. Now, what happens is, as Bandera and his fellow nationalists kind of realize that the Nazis have absolutely no intention of creating some kind of Ukrainian independent state, despite the help they've been giving them. They arrest and imprison Bandera because of his refusal, I say, to abandon this idea. And a new force now emerges, the Ukrainian insurgent army. So this arises during the war. And you'll see, I've got some figures there to give you an idea. But I say, but they fight essentially for both sides. And this is very right-wing, this. It basically aims to ethnically cleanse Poles from the areas that it claims. So its Ukraine is this Galicia. It's a small kind of rump of what we think of as Ukraine today, and they want to create their own independent state there. The Nazis have let them down, so they're going to start their own insurgency now to get rid of all these other minorities. And it's dreadful. I mean, tens of thousands are killed in massacres and reprisals and so on. They also fight the insurgent army against the Soviets as well. At times they end up fighting against the Germans. It's chaos, really. But it's all about, fundamentally, this Ukrainian independence. Now, the legacy itself of all of this is very controversial in Ukraine. For some, it symbolises resistance, and, Bandera and people like that be heroes, because you're resisting the Nazis and the Soviets. For others, of course, it represents collaboration. And it represents ethnic violence, and so it's a difficult kind of memory. So what you have is, by the end of the Second World War, you have a very weird three-sided conflict raging now. You've got Bandera's sort of right-wing Ukrainian nationalist guerrillas. You've also got Polish underground fighters as well, and you've got Soviet partisans. And they're all kind of fighting each other in this borderland, which is what the Ukraine, as we said, is. And of course, it's a land that's already devastated by occupation, by famine, by genocide, by all these dreadful things. But it's going to carry on and on and on now for years. So you do now, during the war itself, and just to add to the sort of horrors of this, of course, one thing Stalin would do, because he's very suspicious of these border territories and the loyalty of the people within them, and you get this in the Baltics as well, that Stalin will now start to move populations en masse. So you basically throw these people on trains and dump them out in Siberia. So they're sent off there. Because the point is, if the Germans invade, you can't trust, these could be a fifth column and so on, so you get rid of them. And it's horrible. I mean, ethnically cleansing all these kind of places, hundreds of thousands of them. When it comes to the Ukraine, he targets particularly these people here, the Crimean Tatars I mentioned earlier. They're expelled from their homes overnight, and these descendants of the Mongols, and they're basically dumped now in Central Asia. So, and you can see this is their village gone. So, you just, like the Nazis did, you just, you have a few hours to pack a bag, whatever you can carry, throw you on a cattle car, off you go to Siberia, you're dumped out, and, get on with it, and good luck. Of course, what you do have, I say, with a map, remember, is and Poland itself shifts westward. So when they redraw the map after the Second World War, Poland moves further to the west. And again, that's the plan that, of course, Churchill famously comes up with. He has 3 matchsticks when he sits down with Stalin and says, why don't we just move everything slightly, shift everything to the west? And what it means is ethnic Poles who were in what was Poland are now evicted from their ancestral homes in what will become now Western Ukraine. And again, let me try and show you this. So the city of Lvov becomes Lviv in Ukraine, now firmly part of Western Ukraine. So you can see Poland itself was much farther to the east now, but with the end of the Second World War, they decide what they're going to do in terms of redrawing the map yet again, is push Poland further to the west. And it means now that there's a large part of what was Poland, which is now included in Ukraine. And of course, so that becomes part of Western Ukraine. And I say the Polish population then is also now expelled forcibly and thrown off into Poland. So by the shakedown of all of this, by the end of this process, by the end of really, I suppose, 10 years maybe after the end of the Second World War, you can finally say that Ukraine's borders included most Ukrainians for the first time in centuries. But the thing is, now all of them are under the control of Moscow. They're all under the Russians. So I said the Second World War had uprooted millions of people. We get, of course, Ukrainians as part of diasporas now. We get them going all over the place, of course, as you get so many other sort of ethnic groups going all over the place. And they, and just to recommend a book for you if you're interested in doing this. And this is just I don't often recommend books, but this is one particularly good. This is great fun here. It's a novel, this is, and it's about sort of Ukrainian immigrants coming to Britain. It's really, really fun. But if you get a chance to read it, how they kind of interact and how they get on with their new home, it's a really wonderful little story. And of course, it's quite resonant because of when the war began, of course, in 22. We had lots of Ukrainians, of course, come to Britain and so on. And it's really, really good. So that's just one little recommendation as an aside. Now, within Ukraine itself, they're still fighting. Partisan warfare is going to continue in Ukraine into the 1950s. We have the same thing, of course, going on in the Baltics. Resisting now. They'd had a sort of period of independence, kind of. Well, at least the Russians had gone while the Germans invaded. But now that's gone and the Russians are now asserting themselves, the Soviets coming back in. And you get now people fighting in the forests and so on, and around Western Ukraine and in the Baltics. Bandera himself, this guerrilla leader we mentioned earlier on, he remains in Germany throughout this. But he eventually is hunted down by the KGB and assassinated in Munich in 1959. And it gives you an idea of how the Soviets now are determined to eliminate any surviving nationalist resistance in Ukraine. So they eventually get him now. A final change of borders is going to be affected now by Stalin's successor in the shape of Nikita Khrushchev. And Khrushchev himself had been a top party official in Ukraine before and after the war. He, of course, famously, what he does, Khrushchev, is during the Holodomor, he goes to Stalin and says, you've got to feed these people. You don't realize what's happening there. Stalin had a good idea what was happening, but it was a very brave thing to do, to go and confront Stalin. He didn't really get anything out of it. But yeah, he has this kind of Ukrainian kind of affiliation. And what happens is, and you'll see this here, to celebrate the so-called successes of the Soviet Union, and to mark one particular event, which we've already talked about 3 centuries before, in 1954, Khrushchev officially gives Crimea to the Republic of Ukraine. So this treaty we mentioned now, back in 1654, they're now commemorating that, and the way they're going to give the Crimea now to Ukraine. And you'll see it's celebrated here. Again, so there's the 2 dates there now. So finally, the Crimea is added to Ukraine, and this is finally what it's beginning to kind of look like. Now, the thing about this, of course, this is all just symbolic. This is a ceremonial kind of, attempt really to kind of, cement Ukraine as another Soviet republic. But it doesn't really kind of mean anything because everywhere is under the control of the Russians. We have lots of Soviet republics, but effectively they're controlled from Moscow anyway. So this is just, I say, rather sort of symbolic of and ceremonial and stuff. No one imagined that this would be one of the most contested issues of the 21st century, this gift of Crimea. So there are all these republics that are kind of ruled by Moscow. So it doesn't seem to be just anything. It's just a formality, really. It's not a big kind of deal. Now, below the surface of all of this, Russification in Ukraine is going to continue apace. And what you have is in eastern Ukraine, you have a large part of the population who are Russian speakers. Now remember, even if they identify themselves as Ukrainians, they still maybe speak Russian. Across the country, bilingualism is very common. And of course, Russian itself is meant to hold pride of place because it's the language of international brotherhood, of the revolution and so on, of the Soviet Union. About 1/4 of people in Ukraine today identify Russian as their mother tongue. And especially as you go further east, as you can see by this. And again, this hints at what we were saying earlier, the way that Western Ukraine has a different kind of historical experience from Eastern Ukraine. And this is really reflected, language is a marker of identity and whatever. And you can see it played out here. So all the dissident voices and so on in the Soviet period, who are resisting the Soviets, as we get all over, of course, the Soviet Union, are strongest in the West. That's where the most, as it were, Western-orientated, nationalistic, democratically minded, anti-communist, whatever, tend to be the further west you go, you get those kind of people. During the period of Glasnost and Gorbachev's reforms, we do get the formation for the first time of this, the People's Movement of Ukraine, the so-called Rukh movement, which champions Ukrainian identity in a similar way to you're getting everywhere. You get all these sort of protest movements in the Baltics and so on. You're getting all these different groups and so on. These protests actually, what happens here is they're actually sparked by the Chernobyl disaster. And mainly the state's attempt to hide the impact of the Chernobyl disaster. So it actually kind of begins as a kind of environmental protest movement. And then it merges now into something bigger about Ukrainian identity. The Ukrainian church, which had been banned, resurfaces now underground. It now starts to come out as well during Glasnost. So you get a reawakening, as it were, of Ukrainian national consciousness, which had disappeared for a long, long time. Now, towards the end of the Soviet period, with the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, Ukraine does become independent. Of course, there we are. There's the date, 1991. In a referendum which they hold on the question of independence, 90% of voters are in favour of independence. Now, as I say, lots of Eastern European states, former communist states, are trying to orientate themselves towards the West, and they're behaving very nicely as well as they can so they can get into the EU, get NATO, get all that money. But there is a kind of confusion here, particularly with someone like Belarus and Ukraine, because Ukraine becomes one of the founding members of the Commonwealth of Independent States, which is a kind of... here we go. Yeah, here's the referendum here. So you can see the figures to give you an idea which areas were which. And you'll see just how heavily in the West people are voting in favour, even though most people actually do. But this is the Commonwealth of Independent States. Again, this is often the Russian Federation, what people call this. And, it's a kind of EU, I suppose, to kind of replace the Soviet Union, economic ties and so on. And they become part of that. Now, to be fair, remember, this is the period where Russia itself seems to be moving towards liberal democracy, towards freedom and so on. So why wouldn't you kind of join? It makes kind of sense. There are also, of course, lots of people in Ukraine as well who want to be part of this move, this return to Europe, this Western kind of European alignment. And that means, as we said at the start, if you want to do that, you have to orientate Ukraine towards the institutions of the West, which is particularly the EU and NATO, being the two of them. So the problem with Ukraine is how can you combine these two kind of commitments at the same time? That's the big kind of issue. And this tension, I say, in Ukraine between the eastward ties, westward kind of aspirations and so on, is the great defining dilemma of Ukrainian politics. Now, just to show you, I say, so it's a very diverse population we have, and it's one divided between East and West. But again, just to give you an idea of what you're talking about. So you've got Ukrainian-speaking Ukrainians in Ukraine. You've got Ukrainian-speaking Russians. You've also got ethnic Russians. There's also, of course, a Jewish population as well, which shouldn't be forgotten, which is notable in Ukraine. You've got as well the Crimean Tatars. What's wonderful about the Tatars, by the way, is after all this happens, they come back. So they're all dumped out by Stalin. Bless them. They go wait a generation, and then they come back to the Crimea to live there. You've got to admire that. That's kind of amazing. And you also have, of course, sort of competing branches with the Orthodox Church. You've also got the Uniate Church, the Native Church, and so on. So there's a lot of complexity when it comes to coming up with some kind of homogenous national identity for Ukraine. At the same time, of course, the economy itself and the state institutions generally are in a terrible condition. You've still got that problem as well. And, the great problem for Eastern Europe after the fall of communism is trying to transition from this very centrally planned communist economy into a free market economy. It's very difficult. And how do you do it? If you do it, try and do it gradually, of course, that's going to be very, very painful for people. But if you do it immediately, if you kind of change it, that's going to be a short, sharp shock, which may kind of work, but it's still going to cause huge amounts of pain. I mean, one economist said of this change that you can't do it gradually. You have to decide overnight that we're a different kind of, state. We're no longer part of a planned economy. So he said, you can't change lanes. You can't change what side of the road you drive on gradually. If you turn on the left or drive on the right, you have to do it kind of immediately. That's always a problem, this transition. And of course, what you have, particularly in Russia, and you get the same thing in Ukraine, you get a class of powerful oligarchs rise up. And these are kind of entrepreneurs. They're almost like robber barons, these people. Now, who in the chaos and so on, they take advantage of that grey area between the planned economy and the free market economy to basically buy up assets. And they buy up gas and all kinds of different big assets. And so many of them are just super rich people now. And of course, what they end up doing is in many of these states is they found political parties of their own, which are nothing but their own vehicles for influence and advancement. They're not interested in politics particularly, but what they want to do is make sure that their money, their position, and so on, and their control is basically protected. So what you end up with in Ukraine and elsewhere is a kind of political system that looks democratic on paper, but is often just dominated by inside networks, informal power, these kind of things, and all these kind of oligarchs. In Ukraine itself, in the year 2000, there's a huge scandal, and this is the so-called cassette scandal. And what happens is, the year 2000, you get secret recordings now from the president, Leonid Kuchma. His voice is on these recordings, where he orders his entourage to deal with a troublesome muckraking journalist, which is this young guy here. And soon after this, the journalist himself is found dead. And again, that shows you the level of corruption. It is almost like organised crime in many ways, these political leadership cliques and so on. And of course, corruption dribbles down at every level of government now. There's corruption. It eats away at people's confidence in the system. And, economic productivity lags because everything's being sucked away by these big oligarchs and so on. And people grow more and more frustrated. Now, I say Ukraine, just to revisit this, just to mention this again, Ukraine finds itself particularly dependent on Russia for its energy supplies. And I mentioned about a third in Western Europe. When it comes to Ukraine, it's something like 75% of its gas, about 80% of its oil. Incredible. I mean, it really does control the energy needs of Ukraine. And what it does, Ukraine, is to overcome this dependency. It seeks international financial aid to prepare eventually for reforms and to change the system. And it does this particularly with the Budapest Memoranda of 1994, where in return for economic cooperation, for security guarantees, it gives up its nuclear deterrence. So nuclear disarmament. So Ukraine will no longer have lots of nuclear weapons, of course, were stored in Ukraine, as you imagine, in the Cold War. But this is a subject now of intense debate, of course. You imagine if Ukraine had nuclear weapons now, I mean, God knows what would happen. They're given kind of security guarantees. And I would say one thing about security guarantees. Security guarantees in history never really pan out. I know there's a lot of talk about security guarantees now for Ukraine, but if history is anything to go by, they're never really worth the paper they're actually written on. They're a way of ending kind of conflicts with these promises. And of course, it's not come true for Ukraine. The promises weren't really delivered on at all. But over time, what you get is this disappointment, this frustration with all this insider politics and and all this corruption will produce now in 2004 a popular movement called the Orange Revolution. And the leader of the Orange Revolution is this man here. This is Viktor Yushchenko. Now, he'd been kind of an economist, head of the central bank in Ukraine. He's a kind of Mark Carney figure, if you want to think about that kind of figure. He's that kind of person. And he's going to stand now to be president. And his coalition promises they're going to fight corruption and they're going to move Ukraine closer to the West. And the country's going on a new course now towards the West, like many other countries in Eastern Europe have. On September the 5th, though, 2004, Yushchenko goes to dinner with the deputy head of the Ukrainian intelligence service, and later that evening becomes desperately ill. And it's very clear that he'd been poisoned, dioxin poison. And the symptoms are visible on his face. You can see here how it changes. So he's been seen as trouble, and he's now been poisoned. Of course, there's lots of poisonings with dioxin, of course, all around Europe. And the suspects themselves flee to Russia, who are maybe involved in this whole thing. Now, did they intend to kill him? Maybe. Or did they? Some people say they actually intended to kind of disfigure him, which would ruin his kind of electoral prospects, maybe. I don't know if that's true, but it backfires anyway because he does survive. But it gives you an idea how powerful these corrupt forces are in places like Ukraine, and how the Russians themselves outside look to control the direction the country is going on. And he is seen as someone who's very, very dangerous, so they're trying to do away with him. Now, the government itself, what you get is you do get the presidential election, but they try and fix the election. There's election fraud, clearly. And once that happens, on top of this, we now get people coming out on the streets. And this is what leads to the Orange Revolution. And they choose this colour orange, which is, again, we have lots of different coloured revolutions, but this is their colour, orange. And the scale of this is astonishing. I mean, it's a very peaceful, very determined assertion of people's democratic will. There are contrasts, though, and again, you may expect these contrasts. The divide between East and West again. To give you an idea, one in every 5 Ukrainians participated in the Orange Revolution. 1 in 5. But in the West, which remember is more pro-Western, as it were, 1 in 3 people were out. So a huge amount, a third of all the people. In the eastern regions, the so-called Donbass and Luhansk region, fewer than 1 in 20 actually came out and joined the demonstrations. So it gives you an idea of the divided kind of views on either side of Ukraine. So you have these huge demonstrations in Independence Square and so on, and this in Kyiv, which is the kind of heart of democratic life, I suppose. And over 17 days, or after 17 days, they finally win. And Yushchenko wins the election and becomes president. So there we go. There's the result of the presidential election. And again, I don't need to show you here, but you can see the division between East and West Ukraine. You can see the reformer, the pro-Western Democrat in orange, and then the more kind of pro-Russian, more authoritarian figure of Yanukovych in the East. So, but he wins anyway. Now, what's odd about this is Yushchenko wins, and we think, well, that's it. That's it. No, he's off. He's great. But it's actually kind of disappointing what he ends up doing. Because rather than kind of the Orange Revolution, rather than them making kind of common cause now and say, wow, we've won, this is amazing, we're going to move forward now, they start kind of arguing with one another. And obviously there's some people, as you can imagine, in the revolution who want to move things really quickly and completely uncouple, as it were, from any Russian alliance at all, and get really hard line, as it were, for independence. There's others who want to be more gradual. And what happens is, along with personal rivalries and factionalism and so on, the great reform movement is actually kind of paralyzed. And you don't really get any great progress made. And the hopes of the Orange Revolution really begin to fade away. Capitalizing on the frustration of the people, you get radical Ukrainian nationalist groups, many of whom celebrate Stepan Bandera as their great hero. They start to gain more support. Now, these groups remain very, very small, but they do exist. So these are rabid, right-wing Ukrainian nationalists. These are the people Putin calls Nazis. Now, so Ukrainian nationalists at its extreme equals Nazis. And the Russian media completely exaggerates their influence and so on. But they do exist. They are something. In 2010, a disaster happens, mainly because of the divisions within the opposition. And what they do is they allow in now this man here, Viktor Yanukovych. He's elected president. And his support is based in the eastern regions. As you may expect, he has the support of Vladimir Putin as well. And he is very pro-Russian, very anti-Western. He tells NATO that Ukraine, which had been considering membership of NATO, is no longer interested in joining. I'll show you actually the election result, and you can see here. So there you go. I say you can see the kind of divisions between the reform movement and so on. He also jails his opponent, which is Yulia Tymoshenko, which is this lady here who finishes second. This is Yulia Tymoshenko. Here she is. She was the co-leader of the Orange Revolution. She was a former prime minister, actually, of Ukraine. And she's accused of corruption in office. Corruption is always something that authoritarians accuse people of. You may have seen that yourself recently in many contexts, but it's always the thing they say. But you can see her. Look how she's linked in with all these major kind of Western figures. She's someone they see as dangerous in the pro-Russian side of Ukraine. So she's thrown in prison. She will get out, though, eventually. And now we get a return in Ukraine to the authoritarian habits of old now. At the end of 2013, Yanukovych himself negotiates an agreement to have an association with the European Union, which is a pathway to joining the European Union, and then refuses to sign his own agreement. Very strange. So it's a big reversal. And we imagine the reason is that he's been told from Moscow, well, what are you doing? No, you don't join Ukraine. No. Calm down here. No, don't do it. So he cuts that off completely. And now EU membership as well as NATO, they've both been, I say, pushed to the back burner. That particularly triggers outrage, because that was that's the pathway that most Eastern Europeans see. Again, it's going to be a rocky road to kind of get there, but they can see a future in which they can join NATO and which they can join the EU, economic, material prosperity, security as well. Again, we'll get there eventually. Now, what happens is, because of that decision and how sudden the whole thing is, we get mass protests again. And they erupt in Kyiv, in Lviv, all these other cities. And this is centered on, again, on Independence Square. You'll see here, actually. I don't know if this will come on. But yeah, here's some of the images from this. These are known as the Maidan Uprising. So anyway, so that gives you an idea of the scale of this thing, the pure outrage of it, and a massive protest now. There's Vladimir Klitschko down there, of course, the boxer. Now, they try and suppress this, as authoritarians do, and dozens of protesters are killed. By February 2014, because of this uprising now, Yanukovych himself ends up falling from power. And yeah, you can see here, this is Yanukovych himself, and he accepts lots and lots of money, a bailout, billions and billions of dollars. And yeah, so there he is. He's very close, I say, to Putin. You can look at that, I say, in your own time. But what happens is the sheer scale of these protests in 2014 means that he ends up having to flee. Again, like many authoritarians, he ends up fleeing and runs off to Russia, no surprise. And then there follows a very strange scene, because they've lost their president now. They've chased him out of the country. And we have something very reminiscent, actually, of the French Revolution, where all these people leave Paris and go to Versailles and start, and looking and poking around Versailles, where people now go to look at Yanukovych's vast estate that he has near Kyiv. And so they just leave Kyiv, all these protesters, he's gone now, and they're going to go and look at this massive compound, this secret hidden compound that he has out there just outside Kyiv. And what it does, when they go there, they realise the extent of his corruption. He's total oligarch. It's incredibly ostentatious and outrageous. This big mansion that he has, which is built in a big, it's built in a very sort of peculiar, eclectic style. It's very overblown. It's rather like you see in the White House now. You get a certain style, you know. And the locals actually start calling it wonderfully Donetsk Rococo. So that's obviously where Yanukovych comes from, Donetsk. He's an Easterner. So he's very strange. It's all rather crude and a bit tacky. But it's a massive mansion. It's 350 acres. And he's hidden this whole thing away. All the money. And to give you an idea of this, I'll show you actually some of the images. You wouldn't believe the stuff that's here. He's got a private zoo here, full of birds and exotic birds and deer and all kinds of things. He's got tennis courts. He's got a helicopter pad. He's got landscape gardens, pavilions, you know, pleasure domes, the whole thing, car collections. Unbelievable. And you can see he's another kind of pirate ship or whatever the hell that is. Now, what they do is, and people just go and they wander around. It's really strange. It's like visiting a museum. And you just kind of wander around and what the hell's this? And sit on his bed and, I don't know, I'm assuming purloin a few things as well. I'm sure that goes. Eventually, the entire complex is declared to be property of the state. And they introduce plans, which aren't actually followed through, which is kind of annoying. I hope they do one day, which for using it as a museum of corruption. Isn't that wonderful? So you can go and see what it's like to be a kind of corrupt person. But yeah, there are persistent rumours about this whole thing. One symbol of his corruption, actually I'll come back there. One of his symbols of corruption is this idea there was a loaf made of bread. So totally made of gold, this loaf made of gold. But the thing is, it disappeared apparently. There's all these toys and whatever, but no one saw it. Did it exist? Did it not exist? Who knows? But that was a kind of symbol of it, this loaf of bread made of gold. Now, I say Putin, who'd been the great sort of patron of Yanukovych, what he declares now is this change of government is illegitimate. He's the revolution. No, you can't get rid of your president. And this is where, particularly, we'll say the media denounces the protesters as neo-fascists and Nazis and all that kind of thing. They actually call them Banderovsky, which recalls the Second World War, named after this guy, Stepan Bandera. And that's what they talk about. So it's part of a deliberative narrative that's been constructed by Moscow to delegitimize now the new Ukrainian government and justify, of course, Russian intervention. And, of course, they'll do this particularly in Crimea at first in 2014. Now, what they do is they send troops in. At first, they actually deny they'd sent troops into Crimea. Now, Crimea does have an ethnic Russian majority. So it does have a sizable Russian majority. But they send all these troops in, but without sort of insignia and so on. Which leads to the wonderful reports in the Ukrainian press. They call them now little green men. There we go. Little green men. So like ICE or something, they all go in. Always, who are you? The Russians say, we didn't send them in. Absolutely not. Yeah. So, but they all wear masks and whatever. And the anonymity obviously is intentional. Because, of course, the idea of this, of course, it creates confusion. It delays an international response to this. Is it Russia? Is it not Russia? And it allows the Russians to claim, I suppose, some kind of deniability of the whole thing. So they move in essentially and take over the Crimea now. And then Russia moves in to annex Ukraine officially over all these international protests. Later, in March 2015, news reports suggested that the inhabitants of Crimea who opposed the annexation had faced violence. They'd been attacked. And one poor group had been attacked with the poor old Crimean Tatars. They make up about 15% of the population of Crimea. And they've just come back to their homeland, and now, again, they're facing violence and so on. So this invasion was often sort of pitched as a kind of response to calls for help from the locals and so on. That's what we've seen, let's say, in Transnistria, you see it in Georgia and so on. But the whole thing's just an excuse and it's just a plan. We're here to help our people or whatever. And not to judge a book by its cover, but you look at those guys there and they are a particular type, aren't they? Let's just say that. So the annexation is all worked out as a kind of plan. You create a crisis and then you move in to help and so on. That's what we'll see again in eastern Ukraine. They have a referendum, of course. It's 97% in favour of joining Russia, as if. It's so implausibly high, this, that it's a symbol of the whole kind of shoddy process of taking Crimea. Next, you get sort of heavily armed sort of rebels, again wearing masks, pro-Russian rebels, who now start doing a similar thing in eastern Ukraine along the Russian border. So they start now doing kind of what's happened in Crimea. And you'll see here, this is where the violence tends to be most. And you'll see Luhansk and Donetsk, of course. Basically, these kind of thugs and stuff, they just declare mini republics under their own control. They're dreadfully violent. And yeah, you'll see how this matches the linguistic map. So you'll see here, I say how, those territories particularly. And that's where you're going to get the violence. You do wonder, don't you, if the settlement that is eventually going to emerge is going to look a bit like that in terms of essentially, which looks like we're going towards some kind of partition of Ukraine now. But you wonder if it will be kind of mirror this kind of thing. But yeah, what they do is these kind of boats, a lot of them are just thugs. I said they're like football hooligans and stuff. They're really dreadful, which one observer calls in the press in Ukraine. They create all these little republics and so on, so-called. He calls it the Republic of Random Dudes. Isn't that fantastic? That's kind of what they are. The Russian media now starts referring to these territories that have somehow declared independence, as it were, and by a new name. And that new name is New Russia. So they bring back the name of Catherine the Great now for this bits of territory which they've agitated now and sent in their support and troops and so on to try and, get it uncoupled from Ukraine. And so I'll just show you here. So here they are. These are some of these characters, as you can see. So, of course, he's not Ukraine. He's doing this deliberately, Putin, because he's trying to signal this idea, that like Catherine about Ukraine, he knows the sort of historical resonances that whole thing will actually have. Now, of course, it's in that. So it's in a fairly anarchic situation, eastern Ukraine now, with all these, all these thugs and whatever are in there. And, of course, they're all being armed by Russia and so on and carrying out all kinds of terrible sporadic attacks of violence against the Ukrainian population as well. They do have a lot of support as well, remember, because a lot of pro-Russian people in eastern Ukraine. This, of course, is where we get, to situate you in our timeline, this is where Malaysian Airlines Flight 17 is shot down as it crosses over that part of Ukraine. It's shot down with a missile. Now, the thing is, where did these people get missiles from? These are meant to be the ordinary Eastern Ukrainians who've had enough of the, the Nazis in the West and declared their own sort of, insurgency with small arms. But it's very clear that's what happened is they're being fired by these paramilitaries in Eastern Ukraine, and they're being supplied by the Russians. So we get now communal conflict, which goes on for a long, long time, particularly in areas of mixed populations. The Russians now start to open prosecutions against anyone who reports on funerals back in Russia of men killed in Ukraine. So it's secretly sending in troops, as I say, these little green men, these are Russian soldiers, and of course some of them are going to get killed in the fighting. And they don't want this reported back in Russia by the families saying, he was fighting in Ukraine, because that's not meant to be happening officially. So you can actually be prosecuted if you report on the death of one of your family members who's died. It's a shocking idea. So this whole climate of secrecy that you've got, again, it makes it very difficult for particularly ordinary Russians to understand just how much their country's involved in creating all this chaos and so on. And it leads, particularly to, particularly in areas, that are mixed, are terrible violent events. You get a terrible thing happening in Odessa, which is in May 2014, where you've basically got pro-Russian and pro-Ukrainian protesters fighting each other. It's about 30% Russian, I think Odessa is. And they start throwing Molotov cocktails and all kinds of things. And about 42 people died in the end. They're basically pushed into this trade union hall, which is kind of then set on fire. And yeah, it's dreadful. These are most people from the pro-Russian group. Now, so again, you look at the front lines today and so on, and look at this, and you'll see how they both kind of mirror one another. By 2015, so a year after this, in spite of some ceasefires that are negotiated, which don't last very long, they keep being broken. They're negotiated in Belarus and so on. But the fighting, this low-level kind of miserable fighting goes on. About 5,000 people are dead. And yeah, you'll see this kind of thing here. And about 1 million people have become refugees. So 1 million people are fleeing to either side. And yeah, it's, to be a civilian in one of these regions of eastern Ukraine, you know, mortar attacks and crossfire and snipers and God knows what, entire communities are being uprooted and a big humanitarian crisis. And of course, the question always is about this, and this is the worry, as I say, is this kind of thing going to be the new normal in Eastern Europe? That's the real kind of worry. As I say, go back to what we said at the start. Is this kind of thing going to happen, you know, again? Because there are so many flashpoints. There are so many minority groups in different countries. And yeah, it is a very, very worrying kind of situation. I say Europeans had assumed that this kind of large-scale territorial conflict was over. It was a thing of the past. Of course, only now are people realizing that it maybe isn't. And we have to retool and change our focus. Back in 2008, apparently Putin told President George W. Bush at a summit, who was rather startled, he said to him, Ukraine is not really a country. And Bush objected. This is 2008. Bush said, well, hang on a minute. But Putin said, I could occupy Kyiv in 2 weeks. Now, again, if you think about the original Russian plan, it's rather scary the way this idea had been percolating in his mind for a long, long time. So, I say, these kind of historical echoes and yet another partition of Ukraine, maybe something that's actually coming on. What he does, I see, he sponsors all these kind of thugs and stuff. And this is another thug. I mean, look at that man. That man's never worn a suit in his life, has he? Except when he's in court. I mean, you'd cross the street to avoid him, wouldn't you? Look at him. This is Vladimir Zhuravnevsky. He's the leader of the bizarrely named Liberal Democratic Party in Russia. He's an extreme nationalist. And what he does, interestingly enough, he suggests that maybe other countries should join in with this partition process. And this is fascinating when you think historically. What he says, he's being very sly and so on, but what he says is he sends letters to the governments of Poland, Hungary and Romania and says, well, you know, Ukraine isn't really a country anyway, and, you know, we're going to take back our bit, as it were, in eastern Ukraine. But you know what? The Poles, they kind of nicked your bit, didn't they, in the past, as we said, the Second World War. Hungarians, they've got a bit of yours. So he's trying to create a new kind of coalition of people who maybe will rip Ukraine apart. And Ukraine, rather like Poland did, will just disappear now under these new countries. Now, they obviously ignore this completely, but it gives you an idea. He writes in the letter, Zhuravnevsky, he writes, it is never too late to correct historical errors. So it's never too late if you want to join in this partition the way we're doing it. And that gives you an idea, as I say, when you think about Moldova and so on, the way that Putin's mind's kind of working. Now, the thing about this, I say, is all this is going on, Western leaders consider how to react. And repeatedly, they keep saying this even today, how surprised they are that, you know, one of them says, actually, I can't remember who it is, but one of them says, surely Putin knows that we're now living in the 21st century, that this kind of thing, you don't do this kind of thing anymore. And these deeply held Western assumptions that now when the Second World War's over and communism's over, you're going to have a period of peace now and conflicts will break out, but they won't be in Europe, they're all over the world. And that complacency, as I say, is something that Europe has had for a long, long time. And with everything changing in the world as it is today, it's now beginning to finally reorientate itself. So this very comfortable kind of notion that kind of exists. So the European Union and United States condemn Putin's advances, what he's doing. They impose sanctions on trade with Russia. In some cases, quite reluctantly, actually. They're not really that interested. It seems like another conflict on the edge of kind of nowhere. And what you do get is, so Crimea has been taken. There's agitation now, pro-Russian agitation taking place in, I say, eastern Ukraine. And Petro Poroshenko is elected president of Ukraine now in June 2014. And you see, there's Klitschko himself. I'd love to see Klitschko fight that other fellow, wouldn't you? I'd pay to see that. That'd be good. That'd be good fun. So you've got war in the Donbass, you've got economic collapse, you've got political fragmentation, you've got, I say Ukraine basically fighting for its territorial integrity and so on. And now this guy is now handed that kind of poison chalice. They do manage to get a ceasefire, which is declared on the 20th of June when he comes to power. But again, Russian military involvement just escalates the conflict constantly. And Western support, which now starts to come into Ukraine, finally, diplomatic, financial, military aid starts to come in. And what it does is it helps freeze the front lines now in eastern Ukraine. And again, we get this, bizarrely, get this whole landscape of trenches around the Donbass now, fortified positions, and a grinding kind of war of attrition going on, while Ukraine itself slowly starts to move closer to the EU and closer to NATO. Now, this regime of Poroshenko, to be honest, is still riven with all kinds of corruption. I mean, I think Poroshenko, to be fair, I don't know how corrupt he is. He is a reformer at heart. But the trouble is you have to rely on these oligarchs and people, because these are sort of entrenched networks. You want to keep everything working and moving. You end up having to, deal with these kind of people. So progress is made, but very, very slow and very, very unevenly. And of course, he is eventually going to be replaced, of course, by this man, Volodymyr Zelensky, who wins the 2019 election with 73% of the vote, capitalizing essentially on this frustration of the political establishment, how slow it's actually moving. Now, of course, Zelensky is a former comedian and actor, and his campaign was to promise to completely reset Ukrainian politics. So all this stuff he says is just hangovers from the Soviet era. We need to now accept the fact we are where we are, and we're going to change everything. And he does do that. He dissolves the parliament immediately, and there's elections in July, and he gives his party, the Servant of the People Party, the first single party majority in Ukrainian history. So you've got now a very reformist president, very reformist parliament as well, an extraordinary mandate. And what he does, they also start to deepen ties with European and regional partners now. So you get treaties with Poland, with Lithuania, with Georgia, Moldova, and NATO itself reaffirms Ukraine's future membership path. So that's coming down the track as well. And here is Zelensky here. So he starts to steadily move these things forward. In February 2022, Ukraine formally applies for EU membership. And this is a step unthinkable a decade earlier. This is essentially a revolution that he's basically launching. He also, of course, one thing he does is when he takes over, he takes more severe measures against pro-Russian influence inside Ukraine. February 2021, he orders the closure of lots of pro-Russian TV channels, which are just spouting all this kind of, all this propaganda, essentially. That's shut down. And starts to take a firmer stance against Russian influence. If you remember at the start, Zelensky was kind of friendly with, well, not friendly, but he dealt with Putin. He went to meet him a lot and so on, hoped they'd come to some kind of arrangement. But very quickly, he realizes that Moscow itself is one of the poisonous reasons that we're not able to advance and reform and so on. And of course, that eventually is all going to play out. And that's all going to be too much now for Putin. We get, of course, the invasion itself happening in February 2022. This full-scale assault now, which, of course, has transformed Zelensky from a reformist president now into a wartime leader. And, of course, also marks the most dramatic escalation in Europe's security landscape since the end of the Second World War. But hopefully what you can see is this is a culmination now of decades of unresolved tensions, which go back, I mean, centuries, you could say, of competing identities and geopolitical ambitions and so on. And I say how this is going to play out, and I suppose I say more worryingly, whether this is going to impact the character of Eastern Europe in the future, is something that should really make us kind of uncomfortable. So I say history is always there in the background of all these present day events. It's always there in the background of these conflicts. Always these sort of crossroads that you get of empires and identities and ambitions, and so on. So so we look forward to the future, I think, with an air of kind of trepidation. Okay, everyone, so I'll leave it there, but hopefully it gives you some kind of broad background. And again, let me know if you want any more information on this or that, or advice on reading or whatever. But until next time, take care of yourselves, and I'll see you soon. Bye-bye.